As you can see, we'll be reading Hebrews 13, 5 through 6. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? You may be seated.
Good morning, church. Congratulations on being here at the right time this morning. There are some who may not receive that congratulations, but they'll be here, so that'll be a good thing. The story is told about a general who was making the inspection of the 82nd Airborne Rangers at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And the general reviewed the ranks of the paratroop trainees. He carefully scrutinized this one trainee who was from West Virginia. This man was standing proudly, his jump wings and his boots shined to perfection. But the general spotted a loose thread on this man's jacket. He said, "Trooper, your fatigue jacket is frayed." And the young private shot back, "Sir, beg your pardon, sir, but this here airborne jacket ain't frayed or nothing, sir." So how about you? Are you frayed or are you afraid of nothing? Now, I'm not an especially fearful person, but there have been some things in my life I've been afraid of. There have been a few times when I've really been scared. One of the scariest moments of my life occurred when I was a student at Northeastern Christian Junior College. And I was working as the night watchman. And my job was to make a tour of the campus once an hour and to check into certain points. I had this clock that hung around my shoulder on a strap, and there were key stations that would stamp the time that I was there. So I'm making my rounds. It was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on a dark night, and I'm walking down the road that goes from the mansion down through the rest of the campus, and there's a beautiful kind of waist-high stone wall that goes all the way down this entry road. And as I'm walking along, I can hear something walking on the other side of the wall. And as I walked, it would walk, and when I stopped, it would stop. And I'd flash my light over there and try to see what it was, but I couldn't hear it or see it. So I'd start walking again, and it would start walking again. So I came to a place in the wall where there was an opening and a sidewalk over to the gymnasium. And I'm standing there, and I'm shining my light, and I'm hearing this thing approach me, and I cannot see it. And it's continuing to come, and my heart is beating. I think it's going to come out of my chest. And I'm standing there, and just as it gets to me, a skunk comes out of the undergrowth right at my feet. Well, I turned and ran. I did about 100 yards in 3 steps, 2 seconds. Would have won me a gold medal for sure. But I was scared. A much more serious fear that I wrestled with until my early 20s was the fear of dying young. Because my father died when he was just 31, I always thought, well, I'm going to die young too. So every time I got sick, every time there was a lump somewhere or a pain somewhere, there was a thought, oh no, this is the end. Some of you go through that same kind of thing, right? A little cough is cancer or something like that. So I was afraid I wouldn't live to get married or have children or grandchildren. But I distinctly remember the time when I decided to put it in God's hands and to give it over to Him. And I found a lot of peace at that point. So that's something I want to talk about today. Fear is something that all of us have to deal with. Somebody said that you can boil fear down to 2 things. Number 1, the fear of dying. And number 2, the fear of living. It all boils down to one of those 2 things. fear of dying or the fear of living. Before we go any further, though, let me say that some people deal with such crippling fear that they might need to see a counselor, they might benefit from medication. Their problem may have some kind of organic or physiological issues, and they need some help with those things. But also let me clarify that all fear is not bad. God has given us the ability to fear and to be afraid, and for good reason. Good fear keeps us from doing things we shouldn't be doing, like driving at 200 miles an hour. We should fear that. Like jumping off a rooftop or playing with rattlesnakes. These things should cause us some fear, and we should avoid them. That kind of fear is for our protection against unnecessary harm. But also the ability to fear is important in our relationship with God, as you see these scriptures before you. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. Or Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And I like what Jesus said. He said, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Matthew 10 and verse 28. And then Peter summed things up in his little letter. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God and honor the king. So there are some things we should fear in a very helpful way. And God, first and foremost, is someone we should have a healthy respect for. But there's also a kind of fear in life that can become overwhelming. And when you think about it, there's a lot in our world that is quite scary. In some respects, there's a lot to be afraid of. Think of the tragedies around us, or the catastrophes that strike, or the crises. We live in a world where there's terrorist attacks, and there's violent crime. We live in a world where there's corruption and pollution and disease and death. So how can we keep fears about these things from overwhelming us? Well, my answer to that question is that conquering fear is not ultimately a matter of self-determination, but a matter of God dependence. Our scripture reading for today speaks to that truth. Look again with me at Hebrews 13. Keep your lives free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Interestingly enough, both of these quotations from Hebrews 13 come out of the Old Testament. The second piece of that quotation comes from Psalm 118. It speaks of the confidence we have of God's eternal love, that it's unchanging. Even in the midst of changing situations, God's love remains the same. The other one comes out of Deuteronomy 31. What's happening at the time for God's people there is there's a transition in leadership going on. The leadership of Moses is coming to an end. He's passing on the mantle of leadership to Joshua. And so in chapter 31 and verse 1, the Bible says, then Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said. Then Moses continued, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. The Bible continues. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land the Lord swore to their forefathers to give them. You must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. So the writer of Hebrews, so many years later, is telling God's people of that time, in and telling us as well that just as God told the Israelites way back there that he would never leave them nor forsake them, so he would be with the people of God in the time of Hebrews 13, that he would never leave them nor forsake them. And the same is true for God's people today. He will never leave us nor forsake us. Ultimately, we don't have to be afraid because God is with us. As the Bible says there in Psalm 139, verses 1 through 10, O Lord, you've searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in behind and before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. How wonderful it is for us to know that God knows us so intimately, so personally, and that there is no place where we can go or be sent where God is not with us to help us and to guide us. I want to have the kind of faith that the psalmist expressed in Psalm 46 when he said, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, and though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their singing. Verses 11 and 7, both of that psalm conclude, the Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So in the midst of the crisis, in the midst of the chaos, mountains quaking and the sea foaming and everything coming unglued, God is our rock and our refuge and our fortress. We don't have to be afraid. Look at the wonderful promise God made to Israel in Isaiah 41. But you, O Israel, my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth, from its furthest corners. I called you. I said, you are my servant. I've chosen you and have not rejected you. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And then verse 13, for I am the Lord your God who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, do not fear. I will help you. Do not be afraid, O worm Jacob, O little Israel, for I myself will help you, declares the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Don't you love that picture? God's going to uphold us with his righteous right hand. And at the same time, he takes hold of our right hand. He takes hold of our hand and he gets our attention. He looks at us and he says, don't be afraid. I'm holding on to you. Trust me. I'm with you. Look at the promise Jesus made to his disciples as he was leaving the earth to return to heaven. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So even though he was going back to heaven, he wasn't leaving them alone. From heaven he would be with them. Through the Spirit he would send. He would never leave them nor forsake them. Now I'm told that one tribe of Native Americans, and perhaps you've heard this story before, that they had this unique practice for training young men in courage and for marking that transition from boyhood to manhood. And so on the night of a boy's 13th birthday, they would take him into the dense forest where he would have to spend the night alone, blindfolded. And imagine what it felt like to sit there on a stump in the dark, dense forest with a blindfold on all night long. Every time a twig snapped, he probably visualized a wild animal about to pounce on him. Every time an animal howled in the distance, he wondered if he was coming to get him. Every time the wind blew, he wondered what more sinister noise that wind might be masking. No doubt it was a terrifying night for many a young man. And yet, after what must have seemed like an eternity, the first rays of morning light entered the interior of the forest, and at that point the boy was allowed to remove his blindfolds. And when he did so, to his utter astonishment and relief, he would behold the figure of a man standing nearby, armed with bow and arrow. And the man was his father, who'd been there all night long. Boy didn't know it, but there he stood, watch over his son. Consider the words again from our scripture reading. God said, "Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you." So we say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid." God our Father stands guard over us as our helper. And we need not be afraid. And even though, like the boy with the blindfold, we can't see him with our eyes, doesn't mean he's not right there, standing guard. In the British Museum in London, there's an old mariner's chart drawn back in 1525 that outlines the North American coastline. The map was created with information that was gleaned from crews that would sail along the coast of America. And interestingly enough, there were places on the map where reefs were noted, and there were places where the best harbors were also noted. But there were certain other sections that were relatively blank. And those sections contain notations like these. Here be giants. Here be fiery scorpions. Here be dragons. Sounds like pirate talk. Arrgh, right? Well, before this map made its way to the British Museum, it was the prized possession of a British explorer named Sir John Franklin. He sailed in the 1800s. In spite of the map's value, Franklin was offended by the fear that was expressed in some of those statements on the map. And so he scratched out those inscriptions, "Here be giants and here be scorpions." When he scratched them out, he wrote, "Here be God." Whatever giants or scorpions, whatever kind of dragons that any one of us face, they may be real, unlike the ones on that map. They may be real, but we can write beside them, "Here is God." Because He is always with us, and He will never forsake us. He's there to uphold us with His righteous right hand. And therefore, we can face anything that scares us with God holding our hand. One of my favorite Old Testament incidents about faith overcoming fear is found in Daniel chapter 3. Recently, one of the classes studied through Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar, you remember the story? The king of Babylon makes this huge statue, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, made out of gold. And he invited all the leaders of his nation to come together to worship his idol. And so he gave them instructions when they heard the instruments, and he listed off all the instruments. They were to bow down and to worship the idol that he had made. Well, when the music played, everyone bowed down except for three young Hebrews who were in exile, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew it would be wrong for them to bow down to anyone but God himself. So there they stood amidst everyone else bowing down. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar was told about this, he was furious. But he wanted to give them another chance, so he brought them in, and maybe they just didn't understand. He explained it all to them again. He said, I'm going to give you another chance. When the music plays, you bow down and everything will be fine. But if you don't, you're going into the fiery furnace. The three men replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Well, this really made Nebuchadnezzar angry. And he had that furnace stoked up 7 times hotter. And he threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into that fiery furnace. And the soldiers who threw them in died from the heat of being that close. And yet those 3 guys were fine inside that furnace. Matter of fact, there was a 4th person in that furnace, someone who looked like the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar saw what was happening. He ordered them to come out and said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut to pieces. Their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And that's the truth. There is no God like our God. Now, why do I tell this story? Do I tell this story because I believe God will always rescue his people from the fire? No, that's not why I tell the story. I tell the story because we can have faith like those 3 young Hebrew men. We can have a faith that I would call even if he doesn't kind of faith. And the even if he doesn't kind of faith will help us to overcome our fears. Because God's promises, we know that we have a home in heaven. And even if he doesn't rescue us from the fire, we're going to heaven. So for us, it's a win-win. If God rescues us and we continue to live, that's a win. We continue to serve our God. If God doesn't rescue us from the fire, we die and we go on to glory. And that's a different kind of win. But meanwhile, here on earth, we may have to face all kinds of trials. Some from which God will rescue us and some from which he will not. And unless Jesus returns, while we are alive, all of us will cross over that threshold of death. And our death may come because of a drunk driver or a drive-by shooting. Or it might come because of a stroke or a heart attack. Our death might come because of cancer. Or we might just get to go to sleep one night and not wake up the next morning. That's the way I'd like to go. That's a good way to go, huh? But the important thing for us to realize is we don't need to worry or be afraid of any of this. Because everything is going to be okay in the end. And God is with us every step of the way that we have to go. And as hard and as hurtful as our suffering might be, God will be there and he will carry us through. And the only thing that any of us should really fear is God, or is not having God. The unbeliever has good reason to fear. but not the believer. Oswald Chambers wrote this: "The remarkable thing about fearing God is that when you fear God, you fear nothing else. Whereas, if you do not fear God, then you fear everything else." I've been so proud of and encouraged by so many of our brothers and sisters here in this church family who've shown such maturity as they face so many difficulties that come in life. I'm thinking of a number of people, and we could probably almost go around the auditorium as we sit together at any time and just list the things that God has held our hand as we've had to go through. But I was thinking just recently, as I was thinking about this lesson, I've been proud of the Dions as they faced Bennett's health concerns. Been proud of the Warrens. They've been going through Mark's cancer illness as it keeps coming along. The Farlamans, who had long-term struggles that they've had to face. And the Schmittingers and the Latzes more recently with what they're going through. Or Mason with the number of deaths he's faced in such a short time. And the list could go on and on. Sometimes God rescues us from the fire. Sometimes he doesn't. But we have a faith that even if he doesn't, we love our God and we serve our God, and he carries us through, and we don't have to fear. We can take God at his word. He promises, "Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you." This story told of a 3-year-old boy who came running into his parents' room in the middle of the night because of a thunderstorm. And he said, Mommy, I'm afraid." And she, being half awake, replied, "Go back to your bed. God will be with you there." And the little boy said, "Mommy, why don't you go be with God? And I'll stay here with Daddy." So whenever the troubles of the world creep in around us, we don't have to be afraid. Whenever it seems that Satan seems to be having his way, we don't have to be afraid. God is with us. And the Spirit of God is in us. And in the end, faith and courage are not the absence of fear, but the control of fear. Paul reminds Timothy of this when he says, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." And how wonderful it is for us, and how transforming to know that fear does not have to control nor cripple us. For God is with us and in us, and he is our helper. We don't have to